Hi there, and welcome back to Two Jews and a Scotch, a place to think and debate and discuss with the Academy. My name's Rav Ramon, and with me is our Head of Education, Ilana Stein. The title of today's session is Real Vigilantes Don't Wear Capes, from Pinchas to the Second Temple to the State of Israel in 2025. And the reason we felt this was the space to discuss this particular week is that recently many of us have been witness to some disturbing phenomenon in Israel where so-called vigilantes, Jews, have gone on the rampage against Arabs, killing people, burning property, and more recently even attacking the police and the IDF and destroying millions of shekels worth of security equipment. And so we thought, let's explore this space. Is there space for vigilantism in the Jewish tradition?
Right, so this particular incident is quite interesting, of course, the serendipity, I guess, of it, because it takes place, or it has been taking place, around a time that is a particularly dark time for us in our Jewish year. And that's why today we're going to be drinking Johnny Walker's Double Black. Sorry, because it can be that black, the time that we're in. We're just beginning what we call the 3 weeks. And the 3 weeks begins with the 17th of Tammuz and ends with Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the day we commemorate the destruction of the Second Temple. And part of what's going on specifically in the First Temple and the Second Temple, and part of what's going on specifically in the Second Temple period is that the Jews are being besieged by the Romans, just to remind us all. They're being besieged by the Romans. And there are at least 3 groups that have different opinions as to how they want this to work, and they actually spend their time fighting each other more than they even fight the Romans. And there's a group called the Biryonim, possibly also the Sikarim, that decides to take into its hands, it wants to, the people that make up this group want to destroy the Roman power over the land of Israel. They feel they've got a good chance of this. And so they will do anything in their power to make sure that they win. And that will include also killing people that don't agree with them, as well as destroying the enormous storehouses of food that would have kept Jerusalem safe for a year, 2 years, who knows how long. But instead they destroy it, forcing everyone to now be on their side, as it were, and fight the Romans. And as we know, this does not end well. So that's the period that we're in. And this particular group of people, there are resonances with the people that we're talking about today, the groups of people that we're talking about today. That's one thing. The other thing that we're going through is that we have just read the end of Parshat Balak and are about to read Parshat Pinchas. The other time we're living in, as it were, is that we're reading in the book of Numbers a particularly interesting story where we have a situation where the Jewish people are, or certain members of the Jewish people are seduced by the women of Midian, who seduce them both sexually as well as into becoming idolaters, worshipping Baal Peor. And while this is all happening, there is a leader of the Jewish people called Zimri who is literally becoming intimate with a person from Midian, a woman from Midian, and Pinchas, the son of Elazar, a Kohen, a priest, stands up and kills them both in the face of everyone. And that, again, is a moment where how is this possible that a person can take upon themselves something like this? So that's the background of where we're discussing our particular modern issue.
So just to remind everybody, Two Jews and a Scotch is a space which is foundationally Torah-centric, assuming that there is at least 2 profound sides to this discussion. We're not going to disclose our particular views. We've each taken one of these sides. And the aim is to really expand our understanding of Torah by looking at both of the sides of this argument, which is a machloket l'shem shamayim, which is an argument for the sake of heaven. The next session will reveal what our positions were. Just to remind everybody, our last discussion was around the ideal state of rule of governance for a Jewish state. Is it monarchy? Is it something else? So here's our reveal. Both Ilan and I actually were pretty much on the same side of that discussion, which, to remind everybody, was the side of the Barbanel, who felt that the Jewish people could choose the mode of governance which was ideal for them. He opted for a democracy in his view, which he'd seen in Venice and other places. That's what both of us shared. And we hope that you'll be able to take our discussion today and explore it at your Shabbat tables and other places. Just a reminder that we will send out a short source document with the various sources that we're going to use today. And we hope you enjoy.
And on that, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol niyeh bidvaro.
Amen, amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol niyeh bidvaro.
Right. Very dark.
Lovely.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to kick us off today.
All right. Which side are you taking, Rav Ramon?
I'm going to say that Vigilantism is not approved of, and it's not a good thing for a nice Jewish boy or girl or for Jewish society.
Okay, I'll take the other side then.
So let's kick off with the first, let's say, case study. The study of Shimon and Levi, Jacob's two sons in Bereshit. Their sister Dinah is abducted, raped by Shem, and the family comes up with some sort of ruse in order to get her back. It seems initially that Jacob is in on part of it, and they say to the people of Shem, listen, you need to join with our family, you need to circumcise yourselves, because we can't give our daughters to someone who's not circumcised. And the people of Shem proceed to do this, and on the third day, when they're all very, very much in pain, Shimon and Levi, each one of them take their sword, and they go in, they take Dinah, and they kill everyone, all the men in the city. Now, and I think it's necessary to maybe think about this on two levels. This is before Sinai, before the Torah is given. This is in the Noahide space. We're talking about in societies which were expected, from a Torah perspective, to have a minimum level of morality, the 7 Noahide laws, one of which is do not murder, the other of which is do not commit sexual immorality, rape, etc., etc. And when Yaakov hears what his sons have done, he goes mad and he screams and shouts at them. He later curses them at the end of the book of Bereshit. And you can clearly see there's a tremendous repudiation of this act. And when you look at the commentators, no one serious turns around and says, listen, you can take the law into your own hands in such cases. When things are wild, just go wilder. No one says that. The Rambam Maimonides, and the Laws of Kings, he turns around and he says, you know what? He says, this was a perfectly legal act in the framework of the law because Noahides are forbidden from undermining the law. They have to keep a legal system in operation. And all the people of Shem who turned a blind eye to this rape and abduction and allowed this injustice as a system to thrive, they're all guilty and therefore they all deserve death. The Ramban, Nachmanides, turns around and he has a slight technical argument with the Rambam over which law exactly, was it a positive or a negative Torah commandment that the people of Shem had violated. But he too says that legally they were all deserving of the death penalty, and therefore what Shimon and Levi did was perfectly legal. And there just doesn't seem to be anybody who is prepared to turn around and say, Shimon and Levi did a good thing, and this is something ideal we should hold up. Almost everybody, it seems, tries to encapsulate it within the legal system, within the halakhic framework. And that seems to be a repudiation of this idea.
So interesting. From my position, which is, just to point out, it is that vigilantism in fact does occur in Jewish tradition and has its place. So let me see how I can answer you on this. I think while you're saying that the Rambam and the Ramban may be speaking about the idea of a legally they could do this. There is no official court process that is taking place. Neither of them, or anyone says that a Beit Din, a legal court, has been set up in order to paskin, in order to come to a judicial conclusion that says that they are deserving of death.
In the case of Shechem.
In the case of Shechem, we're talking about. So that's very particular. So the point is that the word vigilantism has got a very negative connotation. I'll totally accept that, because it seems to denote a person who actively subverts an existing system. But what we're saying here, or at least what the story is saying here, is that there was no system necessarily functioning. So that's point one. So the discussion then is, in the absence of perhaps a legal system that is happening now, is there room or even a requirement for a person to act when there is no system? And this actually has various halachic specific actions. What we see here, interestingly, is that the Torah never tells us one way or the other if it frowns upon this or not. The story of Shechem has Yaakov ending with shouting at Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Levi responding by saying, listen, we're not going to allow our sister to be a prostitute or to be raped without any kind of recourse. And that's the end of the story. Yes, Yaakov later curses them, but at this point, the Torah is silent as to perhaps which way it agrees with. And maybe the idea here is that there is a space in which people can work that is outside of a strictly legal system in this case. And I'll give you another example of this, actually. One of my favorite characters, I guess, in the Tanakh, and that's Yael. Yael, in the book of Judges, we have Sisera, who is the general of the Canaanite army, at war with the Jews. Yael, who is not Jewish, invites Sisera into her tent when he's running away from the Jewish army and proceeds to put a tent peg through his head, which does and tends to have fatal consequences. So at this point, what's quite interesting is we have a woman who takes the law, you could say, into her own hands. She does not wait for someone to come along and give her a legal opinion. She does what needs to be done in order to help save the Jewish people. In both cases, and in this case, we're talking about two people, neither of whom are Jewish, actually, but the law of murder would still apply. And yet it doesn't. And in fact, she's praised to the skies by Devorah in the next chapter when she sings the song of Devorah. Clearly, she is on the side of right when it comes to that. So when you live in a world which is more of the Wild West bank, as we could say perhaps today, it is possible that when you need to deter and to stop bad actors, there is room in the Torah for this act. And that brings me to where else can we see this actually then in the Torah? And there's an interesting law. If a person accidentally kills someone else, there is a law of what's called Goel Hadam. Goel Hadam is where a person who is a relative of the person who was accidentally murdered has the right to kill the person the accidental murderer, unless that person is able to get to what we call the city of refuge. If that person gets to the city of refuge, then that falls away. He may not do so. But until he does get there, this person can actually go ahead and kill him with no legal repercussions to that. So what do we do with that? He's not liable for murder. That seems to me to be the space in the Torah that says that there is room to move within this particular concept.
So I'll respond firstly to the suggestions that you made around Shimon and Levi and Yael. I think that the concerning reality is in the absence, let's say that you do have an absence of a system. Let's say the system isn't functioning. I just don't see how it makes sense to subvert further a system rather than establish one. I think that's what Yaakov is pushing back on. That, hold on one second, we had we'd offered them to join our covenant to create a particular type of society, and yet you go and use exactly the same tools and methods that they're using in this Wild West bank. How does that further repairing this Wild West bank? The way to do it is not to engage in what they're doing. The way to do it is to show your mettle by creating a covenant, which you had invited them into, and establishing a better society. And I think that I'm not really sure whether or not, you can apply the whole story of Sisera was in the middle of a war. And, under war circumstances, you could possibly claim that there are other things that are applying that. In war, I don't know if it's murder. It's literally he's running away from the battlefield. To relate to the Goel Hadam, the Redeemer of the Blood, I think that it's a tremendously interesting space. What you can clearly see, though, is that the Torah deals with it within the framework. It doesn't just turn around and say, do what you like. It says, listen, here's the framework. There's a city of refuge. You've got to run there. In the interim, there's this gray area, where the Goel Hadam is allowed to do it. But I don't know if that means that it's outside the law or if it's saying that is the law. That because you've taken someone else's life, there's a period in which your life could be forfeit, and the Goel Hadam, this Redeemer of the Blood, is the only person allowed to activate that, but it's still so tightly controlled. I mean, in the Gemara in Makot, Rabbi Eliezer rejects it entirely. He turns around and says, no, this Goel Hadam thing, even that window period of when the person's running to the city of refuge, the Goel Hadam is not allowed to kill the murderer, and it's only after the court process has concluded, so when the court then takes the accidental murderer back from the city of refuge, judges, finds him guilty of real murder, not accidental murder, and then they give him over to the Goel Hadam. And you can see from that it's firmly within a framework at every level.
It is within a framework, I'll give you that, but I'm going to say that the framework acknowledges no framework. Because if you look, in fact, in the same Gemara at Rabbi Akiva, and his concept, he says, no, he disagrees. He says that actually while the person is either running before the court case, so in other words, the legal system has not kicked in. So before the legal system has not kicked in, there is this moment where if the Goel Hadam kills the accidental murderer, not only can he, but he should, in fact, try, it seems.
Okay, some opinions.
There is almost, not quite a chiyuv, I don't think it's quite that, but he has permission, I think, is more the case, to kill before the person gets to the refuge, the city of refuge, and before he starts a court case, there is a moment. There's also another moment, and that is if that person steps out of the city of refuge, once again, it seems like all bets are off, and then the Goel Hadam could kill him, and once again will not be liable for murder. So, in other words, there are parts of this that sit, once you get into the court case, once you get into a court, then legal system kicks in. Before that or outside that, and in other spaces where that is not available, then there seems to be a reshut, there seems to be a permission to allow this to particularly happen.
You're quite right. At this period, we are reading the story of Pinchas in Bamidbar 25, and he does seem to be a classic case of a vigilante who takes the law into his own hand. As you mentioned earlier, he kills Zimri, and we see significant record in the oral law of disapproval of him. The Talmud Yerushalmi says that the sages want to excommunicate him. The other midrashim say that the tribes, the ordinary people, were aghast that someone could go and kill a leader in Israel without due process, and rightfully so. He's a classic case of what we call a knai, a zealot, and it's true. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin does say that in certain circumstances, a knai pug inbo, there is an allowance for zealots even to execute someone, but it's highly delimited, it's highly controlled, tightly controlled, and I think it's far more akin to someone like doing a citizen's arrest, which is within the boundaries of the law, and the law tightly controls it. It doesn't just say to the guy, listen, go and do what you want. If he comes and he asks the Beit Din, they can't tell him. It's going to only be at the time. And generally, I think that throughout Torah tradition, there's a huge discomfort with this. Another example is with the Maccabees, who start off with Matityahu, the leader, committing a very similar act. And therefore the Maccabees, when they talk about their hero, he is Pinchas, because Matityahu went and killed actually a fellow Jew, similar to Pinchas, and started this uprising of the Hasmoneans. And sages are not comfortable with the Maccabees in general.
Interesting. So just to go back to your prior point, where I disagree, I don't know that this is so black and white. I don't think this is about either halakha or chaos. In other words, either it's in the halakha, or if it's not in the halakha, then we're going down a very dark road to absolute anarchy and chaos. I think that the Torah, in fact, is actively acknowledging that there is a space, a gray space, in which it cannot be. It's handing over a space to somewhere else, to something extra halachic, outside. Meta halachic, or even outside of it. And that's where the Goel Hadam sits, and that's where the Knai sits. For example, if Pinchas, if we say Pinchas is a Knai, right? So, and we're saying, well, yes, he does, he goes according to the limitations of the halakha, which is that he had to act immediately. He had to not stop to go and ask a question of a rabbi or whatever in order to do it. That would allow him to be in the space of Knai. But this is where it's outside, is because if Zimri had turned around and killed Pinchas, Zimri would not have been liable for murder. If, however, Pinchas had gone and had a meeting with the Beit Din and they'd said, okay, he is liable for death, for the death penalty, and then Zimri tries to kill Pinchas or kills Pinchas, in that case, Zimri would have been liable for murder. That says to me that is outside the halakha, that Knai now steps outside this particular role. So that's the first thing that I think is important. But we've been discussing the halachic details, really. But what's the context behind it? What creates the context that allows this space, I think, is also really important. And that, I think, would be about leadership or lack thereof. And specifically, if we go back to Pinchas, we'll actually see this, because with the story of Pinchas, this act is taking place in front of the Jewish people. It's chaos, actually, already. And people are praying to idols, and Zimri and Cosby are doing their thing, and everything's going nuts. And Moshe and Aaron freeze, and the leaders freeze. They cannot move. They cannot do anything. They seem to have no capacity for action at that point. It is at that moment that Pinchas springs into action. Because that is the moment that the Knai element can now kick in, when no other leadership is available or is actually taking place. And in fact, I would say that the Torah celebrates that, in the sense where God seems to agree with us, because God then says to Pinchas, or says about Pinchas, I'm going to give him a Brit Shalom. He's got a blessing. He did the right thing in the absence, and the statement in the Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot, but makom she'ein ish. When there's no person to act, you need to act. That's when the Knai kind of steps in and sort of gets activated. And I would say the same thing with the Maccabees. While there were elements of the Maccabees that the sages of the Talmud certainly had an issue with, without the act of Matityahu killing the fellow Jew at that point, the Jewish people was in immense trouble, and was going down a path which might have led to absolute destruction, the same as at the time of Pinchas. So I would say that that there's a moment where sticking to the law will create more chaos, and will create darker periods, darker times, than if you step out of the law.
Look, I just think it's very difficult if we're now bringing this discussion into the modern day, particularly relating it to what's going on in Israel now. I think it's incredibly difficult to compare the reality, if you're talking about leadership and lack of leadership, of the Jewish people mass absconding from the covenant in the space where Pinchas acted, today we aren't anywhere near in that shape, number one. Number two, we have a state with the rule of law. I think this has got both halakhic aspects as well as leadership aspects. There is this concept of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law. And although there is the opinion of the Ran that says that it doesn't apply in the land of Israel, we don't hold that way. And the mainstream authorities, Shulchan Aruch and the Torah, and even modern authorities, they hold that it does hold in the land of Israel and that it does hold in democracies. And from an halachic framework, that means that the law of the land is the law, that the state of Israel has applied law, and you cannot go against that. Now, even if you want to say halachically, just halachically, I'll get to the leadership issue. Even if you want to say halachically that you have permission in that grey area to take the law into your own hands, whether it's the Goel Adam or Pinchas, it seems to me that permission would not allow one to violate a contending opposite principle of dina de malchuta. So you may have permission in the case where there's this grey law in an halachic sense, but side by side there's another framework which is the law of the land. And on a leadership front, and you see this very clearly, definitely in South Africa, that when people disobey the law, bribe police officers or traffic officers, you have this general crumbling of the rule of law. And in the case of Israel now, people going ahead and just literally burning things down, murdering people, that is contributing without a doubt to the destruction of the common thread of rule of law, which binds the society together.
I hear you, and you make a really good point about that. But specifically, this idea of a common framework, or a system of law, of legislation, of government. But where it doesn't maybe apply is dafka within Yehuda and Shomron, with dafka in the West Bank, because the West Bank was never annexed by Israel, by the government of Israel, which makes it an area that is not ruled then by the government of Israel as such, but rather by martial law or the law of the IDF. It's got a different set completely, in which case I'm not sure that it really fits under the idea of this common framework, because in that case, they don't have necessarily dina de malchuta dina. And in fact, what they're saying, so these particular people, which are a specific group, and I just want to be very clear, this is not all people that live in Judah and Samaria or even outside. It's a specific group of people that are saying, listen, there is no dina de malchuta dina. There is no leadership. The leadership of the state of Israel has never made an action, has in fact frozen in making a call as to whether to annex this place or not. We're saying they should annex it, and we are going to use somewhat shocking and violent methods, which we are in within our halachic rights, because it is a gray area here and outside halacha. So we're going to use methods that are maybe looking pretty bad in order to force them into action that we believe will ultimately save the Jewish people.
Which action they're trying to force them into?
And they're forcing them into annexing. That's what they want, is to annex this area, which in that case will then fall under dina de malchuta dina and fall under the government of Israel. So
look, it's a wild approach. What seems even wilder to me is that we now come full circle to the period that we're in. We come to the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Nun Vav, which talks about these different groups that you discussed at the beginning, at the time of the Second Temple, when the Romans are besieging everybody. And what seems to be common, and it's scary to think how similar the situations are, that we're living in a similar space. We have multiple groups within the Jewish state who are all saying the same thing, that the law actually doesn't apply to us, from left to right and in the middle, whether it's ultra-Orthodox people saying, listen, the law of enlistment doesn't apply to us, and other people saying, well, this law doesn't apply to us. And in the Gemara over there describes how the Biryonim, which you spoke about earlier, decide, no, listen, the leadership is frozen. They should be out there fighting the Romans. We're going to force their hand by burning all the food stores in Jerusalem, and therefore they won't sit tight behind the walls. They'll have to go out and attack. And I think it's just, you see what the outcome was. And the Gemara says that's one of the reasons that the temple, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. Before the Romans were able to destroy us, we destroyed ourselves. And the risks of taking this type of action are unbelievable. Firstly, you don't know if your actions are right. And if they're going to have, when I say right, not just morally, but if they will produce the consequence you want. Secondly, the arrogance and the hubris is huge. Secondly, there's no doubt that while you do this, you destroy the common thread that binds everybody together. And you don't see these people redrawing the thread afterwards. They don't weave a new fabric in order to replace what they've burned down. They've burnt it down. You can't simply, build that up again once everyone's seen it burnt to the ground. And I think, it's a tremendous warning sign for us. If that's what we've lived through this once already, we've seen how these groups form and they take on the title of heroes. But I don't know if that fits in even with the gray area that you're talking about of a Pinchas or a Matityahu or a Goel Adam. I don't think that works with it.
In other words, what you're saying is that I may take this action, but whether that action is right or wrong is almost impossible to see. That the risks to do it might be too great and therefore maybe not. But sometimes the leadership is also wrong. In other words, we're not sure. In the case even of the Second Temple period, who was right and who was wrong is quite an interesting thing. I mean, we could say, well, look, this is what happened at the end, is that the temple was destroyed, and we certainly take upon ourselves the fault of that. But it's actually, perhaps at that time, certainly might not have been so clear to them that the leadership themselves were perhaps, by sticking with them, by sticking with almost a lack of action, which is perhaps what specifically the rabbis, the religious leadership was going with, don't do anything, that was going to be wrong. And so they had to take the chance.
You say wrong, you mean it would have had as bad consequences?
It would have had as bad, if not worse, consequences in terms from the Birionim's point of view, the Zealous point of view. And I'll bring you another interesting example of that. And that, again, goes back to the 20th century, in the earlier 20th century up until the 1930s and maybe even into the 40s. But your main... well, even earlier, actually, is that your main body of the Zionist movement was opposed in the main by the religious leadership. And the religious leadership said, just stay as we are.
In Europe.
In Europe, and wait, because that's what we're meant to do. And the Zionist leadership said, no, we have to change things. And what was interesting is that various religious people decide that the Zionists are the ones that actually need, the idea of acting needs to happen, and they form the religious Zionism, this idea of religious Zionism, which is that we need to rise and act. Our leadership in this case is wrong. Our particularly religious leadership perhaps is wrong, and we're going to go against their consensus and the leadership of the time. And today as well, we are looking at people who are saying, I'm just watching how people are being killed, suicide bombers, rammings, you name it. And it's stemming from this area and from the people in this area. How long are we going to just sit here and let this happen and stick around saying, well, eventually it'll come right or something will happen? No, you, the leadership, you need to act. And that is perhaps where they're going in this particular case. However, what we need to, consider, and I think this is the Ikari here, is that we're discussing whether, from a leadership point of view, whether there is room to move here or not. But I think what's really important is to ask the question, can we say that these people, this particular group of Hilltop Youth, whatever they are called, these activists, if you want to call it that are running around burning and stoning and killing people, do they fall into the gray area that is called Knai, that is called the Zealot? Right? Can they? And if we understand that within this category, which is still, I maintain, outside the rubric of the halakha still defines it. And the definition of the Knai is, firstly, it's an individual. And secondly, it's an act of the time. It's a momentary gut action. And in that case, I think we might have some interesting things here, because in this case, this is a group of people. It's a movement. The moment this one individual act becomes a group movement, that does not fit into the category then of K'nai. And also, if it's a long-term thing, it's not one impulsive act at the time that feels right for the future of the Jewish people, but rather something that's longer period, that is also going to then take them out of this particular space. And I would say that if you look at the Maccabees, you'll see that. The Maccabees, Matityahu rises up as an individual and kills the one Hellenist Jew who is about to make a sacrifice to an idol. However, after that, they no longer fall into the K'nai category. His family rise up as a rebellious movement to take back the land of Israel, and that's wonderful. But that's got nothing to do with, they are not considered Kanaim. They are not considered under the rubric of vigilantes or zealots in that particular case. I'll just add one more thing onto this, which I think is really interesting. In the 20th century and again into the 30s and 40s, there was a genre, specifically in what we call graphic art today, or comics, which was the Superman or superhero genre, which, if you think about it, is this interesting idea where one individual rises up to defend the defenseless. Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, Wonder Woman, right? And a lot of those, if not all, were written by Jews who at the time were sitting in America and feeling incredibly powerless as to what was going on in Europe to their fellow Jews at the beginning, certainly before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust. And that was a moment where we needed a hero. We needed someone to stand up. And in fact, Spider-Man is called a vigilante by the police, saying, how can you take the law into your own hands? Which is a really interesting concept to consider when it comes to here. You mentioned the idea, though, that is, if our superheroes stand slightly outside the law, there is a moment where we can be in the law, and that, as you mentioned, is where there is a democratic way or another way where one can be one can act in the face of a bad situation, and that is a citizen's arrest, for example. And in that case, that would be something slightly different. Okay,
so I think we'll have to agree to disagree. Don't know if I'm going to call the Hilltop youths going around doing what they're doing, actually trying to implement citizens' arrests. But I hope everyone has had a chance to reflect on the deeper issues over here, and definitely the deeper issues that are pulling the undercurrents in Israeli society, and definitely where these things head. As we are in this period, which is a dark period, a period of 3 weeks heading towards Tisha B'Av, what is core is for us to reflect on what we have gone through historically so that we don't repeat those mistakes. Unlike the times of the Second Temple when they were going through it for the first time, we are not. And we have the ability, with tremendous hindsight, with all of this discussion, to realize that there may be a machloket l'shem shamayim over here, whether or not the K'nai, the gray zone, is it inside, is it outside? But we have definitely got a far better idea of where this type of action can lead to and its results, and how the fissures inside Israeli society, which we already see on display in a searing fashion, could further be exacerbated and driven apart by this type of action, and what that possibly can lead to. We dive in and hope that everyone has a profound and meaningful period leading up to Tisha B'Av, one with reflection and growth. We hope that you share these ideas and grow from these ideas, and we hope that we learn our deepest historical lessons and forge deeper bonds with the Jewish people to create a much better, brighter future. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Two Jews and a Scotch is an initiative of the Academy of Jewish Thought and Learning. Search Two Jews and a Scotch to find us on YouTube or Spotify, or visit www.adult-ed.academy for more.